Great. We're here. Welcome, everyone. A little bit of introduction. My name's Amber. I'll be the moderator today. We're going to hear from three amazing panelists who will share a bit of their history, reflect on their lessons from combating force and coercion in the mental health system. I've been working with MindFreedom International for 2 years now as an office assistant. I'm a mother, a care professional, and community developer. I'm actively avoiding the institutions so that I can be on the ground and face-to-face with the people who need the hands-on help and education. I care deeply about preventing unnecessary harm wherever possible and abolishing forced psychiatric treatment. So my job here is to monitor the time and ask for panelist feedback when we receive some questions from the audience. And we're anticipating a question and answer session at the end, and we'll collect your input starting now. But a big thank you to everyone for showing up and being present today. Whatever you've set aside to be here and whatever energy you've preserved to be present with this very important topic is super appreciated. Force and coercion in the mental health system is far-reaching, and you've taken this radical step toward being here, so we appreciate that. Whether you're a member of MindFreedom International or an affiliate or just a concerned citizen, we are grateful for your support. And MindFreedom support today is coming from the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health, which brings me to the topic of the surveys. If you filled one out, the preliminary survey for today's webinar, thank you very much. There will be another survey at the end. Thank you to David Oakes, who put that together. We will be using that data to evaluate the effectiveness of our webinar and the effectiveness of reaching people with the information that you want to see. We want to serve our members the best we know how. So that's going to be sent to your personal address after the webinar, and please fill that out. We have reserved the last 20 minutes of this event to respond to the questions that you might have here. We're going to give the participants, every panelist, we're going to give each panelist a chance to answer the questions in this session. For a little bit of logistics about how to use Zoom, I'm going to cut to Jim Flannery, who is our IT specialist, and he can help us look at where to chat with each other.
Sure. So there's going to be two places that you're going to want to look to be able to chat. So there's a button that says chat and one that says Q&A. And so if you just want to say something to the whole group, like of all the attendees, we've got about 50 people that are online on the webinar right now. So if you want to chat amongst each other, you could use the chat function. If you have a specific question for one of the panelists and you want to direct it at them and have them answer it during the Q&A session, then you're going to want to use the button that says Q&A. And that's just kind of a way for us to filter out kind of directed questions towards the panel versus discussion amongst the people watching. And if you have any issues or any things going on, you can click the chat button and you can send me, it'll say like 2, and then you could select Jim Flannery, that name, and you could send me a message directly and I could try to help you out with it. Hopefully everyone is able, if you've made it this far, hopefully everything's working smoothly for you.
Wonderful, thank you. A little bit of information about why this webinar is going out to the world is that we have an intention to connect people who are interested in being activists. We want to connect you with real life people who can be mentors to developing campaigns. There's going to be a flyer at the end of this event to give more information about how you can get connected with free mentorship to develop your own human rights activism. And we will post that at the end. So a little bit about that. So this is for people who want to help with launching human rights campaigns, organize with other people and allies in your community. It's a really great opportunity. We're going to post the contact information for Sarah at the end of this. I'm also inviting everyone here to participate in a moment of silence We want to create a little bit of space and acknowledgement for those people who have died in asylums, people who have been severely and permanently disabled from psychiatric treatment. This includes 2,000 World War II veterans who received lobotomies, tens of thousands of people who live with tardive dyskinesia and brain damage from electroconvulsive therapy, individuals who have died in insulin-induced coma, all sorts of complications from drug complications, complications from combinations of drugs. There's tragedy here, and we want to hold space for that. Anybody who's willing, we're going to have a few seconds of silence and reflection. Beginning now. Thank you for that. I do want to introduce the amazing speakers we have today, all of whom are established leaders in our community of care. They've been chosen for their wisdom and experience. The presentations are about 20 minutes each. For the presenters, I'm going to give you about 5-minute check-in at 5 minutes to closing. And I'm just going to show my fingers in the air to show a check-in about that. And we're gonna get right to it. So our first presenter is Jim Gottstein, who grew up in Anchorage, Alaska. He attended Harvard Law School, graduating in 1974, and spent 14 years working pro bono for the Law Project for Psychiatric Rights. This is known as Psych Rights, whose mission is to mount a strategic litigation campaign to prevent forced psychiatric drugging and electroshock in the United States. Currently, he's in private practice. He's also a psychiatric survivor. Thank you so much for being here, Jim. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks. I'm pleased to be here. Welcome, everyone. Thanks all for coming. Can you hear me okay?
You're coming in great for me.
Okay, great. Well, this is, so I want to really start with the way that I and Psych Rights kind of conceptualizes making change, advocating for change in a strategic way. And this PowerPoint actually is on the psychrights.org website on the homepage there, pretty close to the top. So I call this the transformation triangle, even though it's not really a triangle. And I think that transformation has, kind of been co-opted, and I'm willing to, I'm open to suggestions. But anyway, so I think clearly the most important thing is to change public attitudes. And that's really what people think about when they think about advocacy, of course, is changing public attitudes or public education. I think that when, we're against forced psychiatric interventions, I hate to call it treatment. And I think one of the things that we have to do is really say, well, if we're not going to have forced psychiatry, what are we going to have instead? And to the extent that people understand that these other choices or alternatives work far better without the harm and actually make people safer, it will improve public attitudes. It will make it easier. It will for the public to accept what we're saying. So that's the circle down at the lower left. By the same token, to the extent that public attitudes change to recognize that that there are other choices and alternatives work better, then that will tend to encourage the public to support other choices. So you can see that's why the arrows go back and forth, is that those are two reinforcing things. Now down at the bottom, one of and I've got a couple slides on legal principles. I'm not sure I'm going to get to it, but one of the things is that one of the fundamental principles of United States constitutional law is that when you infringe on someone's fundamental right, such as the right to be free from incarceration, and even the right not to decide what goes into your body, the government has to do that in the least restrictive or least intrusive alternative. And so, but the problem is that you have a judge, and so it's not really that people have the right to those alternatives, it's that the government can't infringe on your rights if they could do it in a less restrictive way. But the problem is the judges don't, have a pretty hard time of just say, if they think that someone's dangerous, to let that person go just because there's a less restrictive alternative that could be provided. In fact, I've got a case in the Alaska Supreme Court right now on exactly that issue. And unfortunately, I think I'm going to lose it. But in any event, the point is that to the extent that you actually have these other choices available, that will tend to make the courts honor people's rights to less restrictive or less intrusive alternatives. But also going back the other way, to the extent that you have lawyers that vigorously, zealously support people's rights, that they shouldn't be locked up because, say, for example, there should be a respite house or a soteria available to them, and therefore the government doesn't have the right to do that. That kind of will tend to force the system to provide other choices. And then now going back on from public attitudes to strategic litigation, to the extent that the public understands, and I think that the judges represent, really the public, the public's attitudes as well, to the extent that the public and the judges understand that the current system is very harmful to people, it's very counterproductive, and it makes people less safe, that will tend to make the judges recognize people's rights not to be locked up and drugged against their will. It's a little bit harder to see it going back the other way, how strategic litigation can change public attitudes. And what I keep coming back to is the US Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which overruled about 100 years of a 100-year-old case by the United States Supreme Court, which held that segregation was legal, separate but equal was legal. And at that time, a pretty wide segment of the populace thought that segregation was okay, after all the US Supreme Court had said that it was. But after Brown versus Board of Education, and I think it had a big part in that, it's pretty hard to find people that will say that segregation is okay. Although frankly, I guess in the last few years, maybe that white supremacy has kind of come back and segregation has come back a little bit. But still, I think that case really had a big impact on public attitudes. So all these three things, I think, work in a way together that can help bring about system change. Okay, how about some more specifics? Can you see the next slide?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, So I wanted to talk about the what I see as the key elements of organizing. And one of the things that I feel like that I've come to realize is the importance of leaders. And I think that's what this webinar is all about, is to get people to, seize the initiative and start doing these kinds of organizing. So that, I mean, I don't know what else I would say about that. But we need to have leaders. And I think, when you look at it, that's where these, whatever success we've had is when we've had people that have stepped up to the plate and just done this stuff. Okay, now relationships with the media is absolutely key. I mean, one of the things we had, or I shouldn't say we, I mean, David Oakes and the MindFreedom folks in 2003 had this hunger strike for freedom in mental health. And in some ways it was widely successful. I don't know about widely, but very successful. Basically, they got the American Psychiatric Association to basically say, well, we haven't found a physical reason for mental illness yet in 100 years, but we'll keep looking. But the problem was that we didn't get a lot of media attention. And I'm not saying it's easy, but what I am saying is that it's something to really look at. I mean, one of the things that's going on right now is we've got this horrendous situation at the border where, little children are being taken away from their parents, especially mothers, and there's this huge media attention to that. Well, what about all the, children that are taken away from parents who, don't want their kids to be drugged, or similar situations, this whole medical kidnapping thing that's going on? Is there a way to kind of make that analogy? I mean, one of the things that I think about, though, is if people remember the Free Justina effort a few years ago, they actually kind of resented, her family resented when, we tried to come in and support them and bring in our own agenda. So it's a pretty, fine line to walk. It's really important to establish, if you can, relationships with media, local media, and then national media to the extent that you can. Okay. Now the most important thing, I think, is, taking action. And one of the problems that we have is that, psychiatric survivors, by definition, have been labeled as crazy. And so, unlike, say, civil rights in the 1960s and, mainly the 50s and 60s, where they didn't have that problem with people thinking that they were crazy. So we really need to be careful about the way that we present ourselves. At the same time, we need to be doing things that bring attention to our cause. And one of my pet peeves, well, I don't know about pet peeves, but one of the things is that, Facebook, I mean, it's like, I don't know, 15% of the whole world is on Facebook. And there's this idea that, that if you like something, that you're actually doing something. Well, I would say that you're really not doing anything by liking something. And about, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, started out as Occupy Psychiatry, and we changed it into the Network Against Psychiatric Assault. And it's a Facebook group, and there's a website there too. And the idea wasn't so much to be doing things on Facebook, on the internet per se, but to use it as an organizing tool. And if you go to Network Against Psychiatric Assault, and then click on the events page, you'll see that I think we probably had in about 3 or 4 years, maybe 50 protests listed there. And so the idea was that that you could combine all of these groups that are working around the world. I mean, there are a lot of protests that go on around the country and around the world, but they're all kind of insular in their own, silos, they call it, and it's hard, people don't know about it. And one of the ideas was to have all these protests listed there, so when people came, they would say, oh, well, really, this is a pretty big movement of protests against psychiatry. So both of those, so both the organizing aspects and the kind of PR aspect of it. I would say, and this gets back to the leaders thing, is it was pretty active for a while, but now it's really gotten to the point where pretty much all that happens is that people share articles, that are basically about psychiatry and how bad it is. And, I think there are probably at least 100 groups that do that, and we're all kind of talking to each others. And I think it's an example of where there's no real leader that's working the network against psychiatric assault. I was doing it for a while, and then I haven't really been able to recently. Okay, having said what I said about likes are meaningless, I will say that, if you can get something that, quote, goes viral, that by definition means that it's getting beyond our group. And that's really, that would be really good. I don't know of anything in our movement, in our effort, that has really gone viral. Okay, and then to end this part of it, I want to talk a little bit about language, and we've had some of this today already. I think, and when there was a comment and at least one comment in the survey about this is using, not using medical language as psychiatric system language. So, for example, I try and never use the term ECT or electroconvulsive therapy. I always say electroshock. I don't like to say shock therapy either. It's not therapy. And by saying ECT or electroconvulsive therapy, you're kind of buying into what this system is saying. And then by the same token, I use the term neuroleptic as opposed to antipsychotic. And it may take a little explanation, but I think it's really important not to buy into the system's language. So am I about out of time, basically?
You're at about 5 minutes, but I believe you that language is a super important topic. Absolutely.
Okay, great. So, so I'll just talk a little bit about some of the legal principles. And there was one of the comments in the survey was talking about the need for litigation to basically get people's rights honored. And I talked about this a little bit, is if something is a fundamental right under the Constitution, the state has to have a compelling interest in in infringing on that right, and has to do so in the least restrictive, least intrusive alternative. Restrictive for commitment or psychiatric imprisonment is, really a more truthful way of saying that. And least intrusive with respect to forced drugging. The U.S. Supreme Court has clearly held that involuntary commitment is a deprivation of a fundamental right. And forced drugging probably is as well. I'm not going to go into it exactly, but the U.S. Supreme Court has never explicitly said that, but they've gotten pretty close. Okay, so for involuntary commitment, the U.S. Supreme Court says it's permissible. And remember, people are not being committed because they've committed a crime. They're not being locked up because they've committed a crime. So the Supreme Court said, well, you can do that when it takes place under proper procedures and evidentiary standards. And this is something that I've successfully challenged. I mean, basically the procedures and evidentiary standards are very, what do I say? It's a pretty low level most of the time. And that's largely because everybody involved thinks that, well, if this person wasn't crazy, she'd know this was good for her. Therefore, we're not going to let their pesky rights get in the way of it. So that's why we need to change people's attitudes about that. Okay, the U.S. Supreme Court said that in order to lock someone up for being, mentally ill, or after being found mentally ill, they have to prove that they're dangerous either to oneself or to others, and that the proof of dangerousness is coupled with the proof of some additional factors such as, quote, mental illness or, quote, mental abnormality. And so this is where they get around the, locking people up when they haven't committed a crime. So one of the evidentiary problems is that basically it's the predictions of violence are very poor. And even if they do everything in the 100% best way that they know how, they can only be 50% accurate. And under another U.S. Supreme Court case, they held that you have to prove, these elements by clear and convincing evidence. And they said, well, we're not going to make them required to prove it by beyond a reasonable doubt because, psychiatry can't possibly ever prove that. But anyway, 50% is not clear and convincing. And then in this other case, Kansas versus Crane, the U.S. Supreme Court, Cooper versus Oklahoma, the Supreme Court said that being unable to take care of oneself can constitute danger to self. Normally, danger to self is thought of as like suicide risk. But they said if they're so dysfunctional or disabled that they're incapable of surviving safely in freedom, then you can lock them up. So this is often, phrased as gravely disabled. But, all of these things are abused, and the lawyers tend not to vigorously represent people. I think I'm about out of time. But the same sort of things apply to forced drugging. The state has to show that there's an important governmental interest, that the forced drugging will actually work. And that I think is basically very hard to prove. That it's necessary for those interests. Well, that's where the less intrusive alternative comes in. The court must find that any alternative less intrusive treatments are unlikely to achieve substantially the same results. And I think we can really prove that those alternatives work far better, and that it's medically appropriate in the patient's best medical interest in light of the medical condition on a drug-by-drug basis. And I don't think they can ever really prove that on by clear and convincing evidence. So anyway, that's pretty much it for me.
All right, well, thank you. That kind of touches the surface of the depth that is litigation on behalf of people's human rights. Thank you so much for doing that work.
You bet.
So we also are going to hear from David. So David Oakes is here out of Eugene, Oregon. Me too. David Oakes is a psychiatric survivor and an established leader in the movement for human rights and mental health. He co-founded the Support Coalition International with Judy Chamberlain, and later co-founded MindFreedom International, becoming its first executive director until 2013. So he was director for 25 years. David consults with nonprofits through Achu Institute. And now we head to David. Love to hear from you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Amber. And thanks, everyone. You can hear I have a disabled voice. If you have any problems understanding me, please say so in the chat, and I will watch the chat to see if there's any problem. Okay, so let's start the slideshow. Phoenix. So I am a psychiatric survivor myself. I had forced drugging and solitary confinement back in the 1970s. And then I began community organizing 42 years ago. Phoenix. I'll raise my right arm for the next slide. So we have a few victories over the centuries. A lot of people do not know that back in the 1620, our people organizing 1800s. There was the alleged Lunatics Friend Society. I love that name. In New York, our people put out a journal, so we've had a few victories in the past. Even someone like Martin Luther King said for 10 years over and over again that he was proud to be maladjusted, that racism, militarism were things he was proud to be maladjusted to. And over he called for a new organization for creative maladjustment. Today, the more common word by psychiatry is disorder. So to update him, I would say we need creative disorder. Creative disorder. A lot of people do not know about this victory. In the 1970s, rioters were considered by some psychiatrists to have a mental disorder, and they began talking about lobotomy. So there was a big controversy. Even Noam Chomsky spoke out, and so quietly in 1977, the government banned involuntary psychosurgery, including psychosurgery of prisoners. This is, of course, nowhere near enough. You know, Massachusetts still does psychosurgery, but it was a great victory. You know, let's go to the next slide. We missed a slide. Let's go back. Yeah, we missed a somehow. Briefly, we are talking today about forced procedures, but I kind of look at this as 3 F's. There's fraud, where they lie to people; fear, where they say there's no alternative; and then force. Now, for some reason, many of us, in fact, 2/3 of people in this webinar see through the fraud, stand up to the fear. We are talking about people who say no and are forced to have the procedure over the will. Their expressed wishes. This is a special kind of rebellion we need to support. Okay, Phoenix, let's see. So we heard Jim mention the hunger strike. That's Grissa. It showed we can get international media. And then we showed there's no proof of chemical imbalances. Next. One of my favorite campaigns was in the office and got a phone call from this person, Ray, who said, hey, I'm getting court-ordered outpatient electroshock every Wednesday morning. A van came to his group home, picked him up, and brought him down for an electroshock against his wishes. I found out there were a few people getting court-ordered outpatient electroshock. So, incredibly, what happened there? Incredibly, Ray was indeed getting forced shock. We did a campaign that got thousands of people involved in speaking out. And it took a while, but we won. And a number of us flew into Minnesota and helped Ray right on the spot. And we eventually won. Now, something to know, everybody. I would say 99% of the public was on our side. Republican, Democrat, everybody. The key thing was proving that Ray had shock. We used court orders and media articles. Once we proved that, we really got people involved. Most people are on our side when it comes to something like this. All right. Okay, next. We're going over. Anyway, another victory was in 2006. Many of you know that the UN passed the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD. So just know there is international law on our side, okay? And an example of how this can help, even the World Health Organization, okay, in Geneva, have come out and said there is a goal to end forced treatment, all right? To end forced treatment. So now they're not as radical as they should be, but that's pretty good. By the way, note quality rights. If you Google WHO equality rights. You'll get hundreds of pages by them about training people for non-forced treatment approaches. Next. So briefly, the cycle we use in community organizing is a circle. And I just picked one, but basically you pick an issue, get people involved, and this builds your group for the next time around. This is the basic community organizing cycle. Key thing, action. Why? Because if you do the action alone, that's cool. Maybe you are an author or a lawyer or a professor, that's fine. However, what we are talking about here is getting a lot of people together, right? So an example of this, for a few years, we had a MindFreedom Shield program. And what we did there is that several hundred MindFreedom members signed up for this. The idea was that if anyone was threatened, we would all speak out. Generally, this worked. However, this in the end did not work, so it is suspended. It could work again. There are some problems. One is there is a crying need for advocacy by so many people. But the idea of the shield, it was and is not about advocacy for all, though that's important, but it's being strategic and picking campaigns to be active on. And I know that's difficult. Sarah, by the way, Sarah Smith has done an amazing job since I fell at keeping the candle lit for MindFreedom. But Sarah has said this can be the most frustrating thing. There are people who are so much in need. Maybe if we restarted the SHIELD program in a way that was more clear, it would help. But right now it's suspended. Okay, next. So at the bottom, you see some of the next May meetings for the APA. They also, that's, I should say, spring. They also have a smaller fall meeting. So protesting the APA is always fun. I've enjoyed that. It's maybe more fun than helpful, but it's fun. Next, pardon me?
You got 5 minutes.
Okay, can I see the next slide? Oh, okay. 5 minutes. So we know about kids taken from their parents, but even though Trump caved, there are still 2,300 kids. Many of them are being forcibly drugged, right? Many are being forcibly drugged. We need to speak out. The slides seem stuck there. Okay. I want to just mention you can read about this on my blog, but the federal government now has a outpatient forced drug program. More than 250 Americans in 17 cities. Now, obviously, state outpatient drugging hurts thousands, but it really disgusts me that the federal government itself would now be funding these programs. 50 million is horrible. Next. I just want to mention that if you are under outpatient commitment, if you are court-ordered to stay in your county, you have to, but many are not. You can leave. We have helped some people leave through a kind of a underground railroad. We have helped some people. It takes a bunch because you need services on the receiving end. You know, we're stuck at, okay. I'll just mention here a few ways to connect with each other. After next few days, I'll be on Twitter. No forced psych drugs. So if you want to try out a hashtag, no forced psych drugs, but there are many ways to connect. But as Jim said, we need more than internet. We need more than clicktivism. We need to take action. And I want everyone to see an example of someone who lived his life fighting forced psychiatry. Letter Roy Frank. Note his birthday is July 15th. And that is soon. During Creative Maladjustment Week. Okay, that's the last slide, but I want to point out that people power has ended like slavery. People power has taken on oppression, and we can do this again with this topic. For the sake of revolution and climate crisis, we need to have a revolution now. Thanks.
Thanks so much, David. Beautiful presentation. I saw in the comments to the side that Phoenix is trying to make those slides available after the webinar. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, moving to our final presenter, we have Emily Cutler. And
Go
ahead and, okay, yeah. All right, so Emily graduated with her BA in communication from the University of Pennsylvania, where she completed her honors thesis on sizeism among adolescents. and develop strategies for introducing fat acceptance into schools. Go, Emily. She currently serves as an assistant editor at the critical psychiatry web magazine called Mad in America. I see many of us are familiar with Mad in America. She's also the founder of the grassroots group, Southern California Against Forced Treatment, which raises awareness about the issue of involuntary commitment and coercive mental health interventions. She's an incoming PhD student at the University of South Florida. She's researching involuntary commitment and MAD studies. And she's passionate about combating paternalism in all its forms. Over to you, Emily.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Hearing you great.
Okay, fantastic. I just want to thank everyone who played a part in organizing this webinar. It's really great to be here and be able to present. So I'm an activist in the MAD Pride movement and in the psychiatric survivors movement. And when I was living in Los Angeles, I founded a grassroots group called Southern California Against Forced Treatment. And I want to share some of the lessons that I learned through that experience. So Southern California Against Forced Treatment is a grassroots group that raises awareness about the issue of involuntary commitment and forced psychiatric treatment. It was founded in October 2016, so it's been around for about 2 years now. So one of the first decisions that we had to make as a grassroots group was whether we were going to focus on cultural change or legislative change. What was kind of going to be our mission and our activities. So to explain kind of the difference between those two, legislative change is all about the law. It's about altering the law, creating new laws, maybe abolishing existing laws. So some examples might be abolishing involuntary commitment laws or reforming involuntary commitment processes. For example, reducing the amount of involuntary commitments or eliminating forced drugging from the process of involuntary commitment. Those could be a couple reforms. And cultural change, on the other hand, is about shifting public perceptions about certain social issues or reducing prejudice against different groups of people, often marginalized groups, as well as altering narratives in the media or in public discourse. So some examples are raising consciousness about the traumatic impact of involuntary commitment, as well as shifting the stereotype that people labeled mentally ill are dangerous. So we decided to focus on cultural change as a group. And we did that because there's currently a dominant assumption within pretty much all of society that forced treatment is not just necessary, but also positive and helpful. So there's really no public understanding that forced treatment is a problem, that it's violent, that it's really harmful. It's really just seen as, oh yeah, this has to happen, so good thing it does, if people even know it exists. And so we felt that this leads to large-scale victim blaming, that victims of forced treatment are seen as deserving of forced treatment. They're seen as dangerous, they're seen as crazy, they're seen as irrational, as this needs to happen to them, that this medical treatment is good for them. And they're kind of blamed for that by really huge, large-scale organizations like the National Alliance on Mental Illness or the Treatment Advocacy Center that spend billions of dollars promoting this message that forced treatment is necessary. So we really wanted to kind of counter that assumption and create change around that. And another reason that we chose cultural change as a focus is because of the kind of difference between abolition and reform. Those are two philosophically different approaches to activism. And we felt that the vast majority of legislation is reformist. So reform being about improving a certain law or improving an institution, system, or practice. So legislation includes kind of eliminating forced drugging maybe, or reducing involuntary commitments. We didn't feel that the majority of legislation is really about eliminating involuntary commitment or forced treatment as a whole system. So abolition really requires more than that. It requires questioning social assumptions and societal assumptions that particular systems or practices are necessary. And we felt like that is really carried out through cultural change, questioning people's assumptions and raising awareness and critical thinking. So that was another reason we chose to focus on that. So our goals were to raise awareness of forced psychiatric treatment, to shift the perception of forced treatment from positive and helpful to traumatic and violent, and to reduce stereotypes and prejudice against victims and survivors of forced treatment. So to help victims and survivors be seen as, just average, everyday people who have had acts of violence committed against them, or as different, but not as violent, not as dangerous, not as deserving of any violence being committed against them. So 3 lessons that we learned from our cultural change efforts that I want to explore more in depth are to make use of the arts, to encourage outness, and to build alliances. So lesson number 1, make use of the arts. As you can see here, 2 snapshots of films that discuss the issue of forced treatment. One is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and another is A Clockwork Orange. So one of the primary activities of Southern California against forced treatment was holding monthly film screenings. So some of the films that we screened were One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, A Clockwork Orange, Zootopia, and Miracle on 34th Street. All of those, including the last 2, have to do with forced treatment. These films really show forced treatment in a pretty negative light and kind of upset this narrative of forced treatment being positive. It's shown as pretty traumatic. So these films were followed by discussions about how forced treatment was shown and what the effects were on the characters, how quote unquote mental illness was shown, how violence was shown, just a number of discussion topics to get people thinking. And as you can see, here's a flyer for one of our events, and we had it at a disability center, which we'll talk more about building some alliances. So it does have a note about people with disabilities and accommodations. So why the arts? We felt that the film screenings and using the arts really challenges prejudice and stereotypes. So there is this stereotype of anyone who's being forcibly treated as dangerous, as violent, as scary, as you need to lock them up right away. And a lot of the films we saw really portrayed the characters experiencing forced treatment as totally as just human, as sympathetic, as able to be empathized with. And we also felt that the films presented alternative narratives about forced treatment. They showed the harms, they showed the trauma that people experience, especially One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Jack Nicholson, for example, does an incredible job showing just how awful ECT was and still is. And we also felt like the arts really create empathy, that the purpose of good art is really about getting the audience to put themselves in the character's shoes. So audience members who kind of came maybe not knowing about the issue of forced treatment often really had more empathy for people who go through forced treatment after seeing it on screen. So lesson number 2 is to encourage outness. And this is something that we really learned from the LGBTQ community. One of the first openly gay politicians, Harvey Milk, once said this quote about outness that I felt really resonated with us. Every gay person must come out. As difficult as it is, you must tell your immediate family. You must tell your relatives. You must tell your friends, if indeed they are your friends. You must tell the people you work with. You must tell the people in the stores you shop in. Once they realize that we are indeed their children, that we are indeed everywhere, every myth, every lie, every innuendo will be destroyed once and all. And once you do, you will feel so much better. So why come out? We really felt that coming out as a survivor or victim, or even just an abolitionist of forced treatment, to those who know and respect you, it forces them into a decision. It forces them to have some kind of cognitive dissonance, and they have to resolve it. So they can do that by either changing their opinion of forced treatment or of victims of forced treatment, saying, oh, okay, someone I know and respect has been through this. It can't only happen to dangerous people. It can't actually be that positive if this person that I really trust and respect is saying how traumatic it was. Or number two, they can change their opinion of you and think less of you. Good people go with number one. The people we want in our lives, on our side, they go with number one. So I encourage people to really come out in ways that were safe to them, of course. And we did find that a lot of people kind of were swayed by that. So some ways to come out include telling friends, family members, writing your story. So actually 6 of our members wrote personal stories for Mad in America. That's a critical psychiatry web magazine that publishes, among other things, personal stories. And so as you can see below, here's one example of that. It's called Subtle Ways Psychiatry Has Harmed Us by 2 of our members, Missy and Skylar Friels. Also, telling your story in a public venue and social media. A lot of our members would share memes maybe, or share even just, a brief sentence or 2 about standing with this cause. And then lesson number 3 is to build alliances and reach out to other groups of people who are affected by the issue of forced treatment and who have historically been subjected to different forms of forced treatment. So 2 examples of communities that we reached out to were the autistic community, which has been historically and still is subjected to institutions, electroshock, or aversive shock treatment, as well as coercive behavior therapies, and also the LGBTQ community that's historically been subjected to all sorts of horrific conversion therapies. So some examples of alliance building, as I mentioned earlier, alluded to, most of our meetings were held at a disability resources center. So that kind of framed forced treatment as a disability rights issue and invited disabled people to share how forced treatment affects them, how forced treatment affects the disability community. We also did a number of outreach activities in collaboration with the autistic community. So below is a picture of me and another member protesting Autism Speaks. That's an organization that really promotes a lot of terrible forced treatment against autistic children. So there we are with a sign that says, performing dangerous, unnecessary, involuntary treatment of children is child abuse. And we also held a meet and greet for our group as well as Asexual Los Angeles. The asexual community is another group that's faced a lot of forms of forced treatment or coercion. They're often told that being asexual is a disorder, is an illness that needs to be cured, rather than just an identity that they can be proud of. So one thing that we really learned through building alliances is to continually ask ourselves, who are we throwing under the bus? Cultural change is all about questioning dominant assumptions and narratives, and we found that challenging an assumption about one group of people while perpetuating that assumption against another group can really undermine that goal. So as an example, since our group was fighting against forced treatment, we had a lot of people want to join our group who were mainly speaking out against vaccines because, we were speaking against forced medical treatment, and they felt that was an example of forced medical treatment that needed to be addressed. But for a lot of the anti-vaxxers that wanted to join our group, their motivation was that vaccines cause autism. And the assumption they were going by was that autism is bad and needs to be prevented. For us, our position was anti-force. And our motivation really was that people should be able to experience any emotional or mental state or characteristic that they choose, that, all characteristics, all cognitive and mental and emotional differences or not differences or whatever traits, experiences are totally okay and should never be coerced into being treated or prevented. So the assumption that we were really trying to advance was that no mental or emotional state or characteristic, including autism or hearing voices, et cetera, is inherently bad. So we felt that, you know, if we were going to ally with people who promote the anti-vaccine position for the reason that vaccines cause autism, that could really harm our autistic members and undermine our whole mission. So it was really important for us to look at that. And that also translates to people who are anti-medication for the reason that medication causes mental illness. We had a lot of people come to our group and say, yeah, of course I'm anti-forced medication. Medication is responsible for psychosis. It causes suicide. It causes distress. It causes all the things that, you know, aren't good. And the assumption there being that the mental and emotional states or characteristics categorized as mental illness are bad, are pathological and need to be prevented. And again, the assumption we were trying to advance is that no mental or emotional state or characteristic, including hearing voices, including, you know, whatever's called mental illness, is inherently bad. So we really requested that people stick to a message and really ask that our members were promoting the message that all mental and emotional states are okay and acceptable and shouldn't be prevented unless a person specifically for themselves wants to prevent that. So I just wanted to share some resources if you'd like to learn more. Our website is socalagainstforce.org, and I moved to Florida a couple weeks ago, so I'm no longer actively involved, but you can definitely learn more on our site. And also I blog at a place called radicalabolitionist.org. And I have a lot of radical ideas on there about the right to experience different mental and emotional states. So you can learn more about that position there. And my email is ecutler@maddenamerica.com if you want to reach out to me. Thanks again.
Wonderful. Great information, Emily. Really appreciate that. We're going to move on to the next segment here. And thanks for leaving a little bit of time. I see you, Emily. So we've got some time to follow up with questions. And there's been a lot of conversation in the chat. And I'm not so good at multitasking right now, but I do want to field a few questions. And Jim Flannery is going to be helping me access those. One of the questions that comes to us, just to get us started, I think that David Oakes might have an opportunity to say something about this, but it's for all panelists who'd like to respond. The question is, what do we have now in our movement that we didn't have 20 years ago? And the idea here is, how can we utilize the resources that we have now to do things a little differently? And I invite anybody who'd like to speak to that.
Yeah, I would especially encourage everyone to think about that. I would say the big difference between now and 20 years ago, well, MindFreedom has been around for 30 years. I am kind of amazed that they have done so well without me. How many of your people may not know that they won this grant, $50,000. They also got an anonymous donation for $50K. So suddenly MindFreedom has $100K, pretty good, guys. So their board has worked so hard for so many years. And now I would encourage everybody on here to think, how can I help MindFreedom and each other? How can I connect? One of my biggest challenges as a director was that our people were all over the world. We have no conference, so how to connect people? Maybe webcams would help, but we need to work together. So I'll let anyone else go ahead.
Great, thank you. Our Jim or Emily, do you care to give input?
I think David gave a great answer.
Okay, great. All right, and I did see some people from France commenting. You know, we have sometimes we get in a bubble and we're speaking. Maybe an example is this webinar. We have a lot of people who are already converted to this idea that yes, human rights are appropriate to recognize and we need to end forced drugging. And so maybe the question might be how can we pioneer new campaigns that that get the message out further than our small bubble of people who are already affected. Oh, I think David got muted. I can't hear David. Oh.
Go ahead now, David.
Unmute me. No, I was just talking with Phoenix here. Sorry.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, either of you, Emily or Jen, have comments?
What's the question again?
Some more ideas about how we can get messages to people outside of the bubble, you know, the bubble of people who already realize that forced drugging is a real issue and they'd like to do something. But, you know, how do we reach a larger population to let them know that this needs to stop? Like, what are our ideas for the revolution going forward?
I think some of it has to do with having a framework of paternalism to talk about these issues. Paternalism is any abuse that's committed for the good of, supposedly for the good of the person being abused. And so that applies to a lot of groups of people that experience abuses. Just as an example, drug users are often also forced into treatment or the criminal justice system kind of for their own good, told, you know, you need to be off drugs for your own good. Or people of size or fat people often face discrimination and oppression and are told that it's for their own good, they're going to be shamed into losing weight. And so I think if we kind of look to those groups that are facing paternalism and show how our issues all relate to that, all relate to being told that, you know, being deprived of our liberty and being deprived of our bodily autonomy is for our own good, if we advance that message and share that common ground, that can help us form allyships.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Someone asked, Julie asked about forced electroshock. Yes, court-ordered involuntary electroshock is legal all over the U.S. Now, most people signed for the shock. Now, we obviously that's a problem, but there are people who refuse shock and get court ordered over their expressed clear wishes. It's only a few, but it's disgusting, beyond disgusting, and it's throughout the U.S. We have, I've talked to people in New York, Minnesota, California. Now this is not speculation. We're talking about court orders, court transcripts. Yeah, it's real. And very occasionally there is forced outpatient electroshock like Ray. So that is God, it bothers me enormous amount.
All right, we also have a question for Jim Gottstein. The question is, how could we rig a tide-changing Supreme Court case, and what would that look like?
Well, I think, first off, it's very hard to get the U.S. Supreme Court to actually take up a case. They, I think, are somewhere around 75, 80 cases a year, and they get over 8,000 petitions for people wanting them to hear cases. So that's really hard to do. I mentioned this case I've got at the Alaska Supreme Court right now, which is a basic fundamental rights case, and it's potentially U.S. Supreme Court worthy in terms of taking to it, if we lose. But I think realistically that, like I said, the chances of getting such a case taken is pretty small, and that the worst thing is the way that the lawyers assigned to represent people in these proceedings basically are not on their client's side, and that's a violation of their ethics, and it results in people's rights being violated as a matter of course. And in fact, I wrote a law review article about that. So I think that the most important thing, again, is, to get people to understand how bad forced psychiatry is. And like you said, Emily, how it's really violence perpetrated against people. So, I guess I haven't really answered that question, very well. But I mean, it's conceivable if we lose this case that we'll, try and take it to the U.S. Supreme Court. But that takes a lot of resources too.
Thanks, Jim. Another question we have: what to do if a mental health agency gets AOT, assisted outpatient treatment, on a client because the client is diagnosed with schizophrenia and refusing to take his medication, and the agency is concerned that that client may hurt someone due to delusions that are aggressive? How can I advocate for the client in this situation? It says Jim Flannery would like to answer. Is that right? Oh, okay. The thing it says. So,
I think one of the things that David said, one of the where they've helped people basically escape. It's very hard to, go against the system. In my experience, I don't even like to call it outpatient or assisted outpatient treatment for sure. Outpatient commitment, maybe not so bad. But I think of them as community drugging orders. And again, they're, the legal requirements to get these orders are not being met, but the courts just go along with it. And so, it's, I don't know, I don't have any great answers. I mean, I think you just have to try and convince them that the person's not dangerous, but that's not, in the end, that's usually not their biggest concern. Their biggest concern is that this person is, being disruptive or otherwise causing problems, or perceived problems.
Yeah, briefly, I was labeled schizophrenic and I was forcibly drugged. So yes, they do try to frame this as a safety issue. But a few quick points. 100% all involuntary outpatient commitment is a failure because it makes your home into a ward. All right, so please do not believe them that outpatient commitment keeps people from entering into a facility. It makes your home into a facility. But yes, you have nailed our main issue, which is that they're afraid that people will become violent. Therefore, we should be drugged against our will. And I mean, I could go on and on, but I will just say, hey, forced drugging is violence. All right, forced drugs is violence. There are far better ways for peace. We need a peaceful mental health system that does not use torture and trauma and violence to control us. It does not work to create peace.
Yeah. There's another question, and maybe Emily, you could speak to this from Berta. She says, can you speak to involuntary treatment, drugs, to avoid jail, diversion, or in the community? I think this impacts more than those locked physically.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know much about this legislatively, but I know that, yeah, this is absolutely an important issue. I really see a large part of this issue as people, kind of prison reform activists, or even some prison abolition activists, saying that people need treatment, not jail, and not realizing the implications of that, and how treatment is pretty violent as well as jail. So I think, yeah, we definitely need to be working to educate prison abolitionists and educate prison reform organizations and activists about what this treatment means and how outpatient commitment, David, you said it so well, how it just turns your whole home into a jail or an institution rather than actually freeing anyone from jail.
Can I say something on this issue too? It's probably different in different places, but lots of times these are called mental health courts, and the basic premise is take your drugs or go to jail. But they have control over you for usually much longer than the time if you just went to jail. And in some of them, including how they changed it in Alaska, you end up with a conviction anyway. And so I'm very negative about these mental health courts, and I would say for people to not participate in them. It's a choice that people get to make as to whether participate in a normal criminal system or to go to mental health court. And people, as you say, Emily, just assume that the mental health court is better, but I wouldn't make that assumption at all.
Okay. We have about 5 minutes left, and another question I see here, can Emily please share any cultural change outcomes from the SoCal Coalition?
Yeah, we had a lot of representation from a lot of different groups. We pretty much every meeting was attended by a number of trans activists, queer activists, disabled people, since they were held at a disability resources center, as well as people of color, people of all different kind of spiritual beliefs and faiths. We did have a Passover Seder that was kind of in partnership with the Jewish community that was celebrating Mad Pride. So yeah, we definitely had a lot of different, a lot of representation from different groups in a diverse community that was thinking about forced treatment and ways that forced treatment was related to their issues and their personal identity. I think one of our biggest accomplishments was there was this unity between both the Mad Pride movement and the neurodiversity movement in Southern California. That a lot of times those movements are seen as like completely separate, even though they share a lot of the same goals. If you're not familiar with either of those movements, both of their goals are kind of about seeing mental differences or, you know, any cognitive trait or state that's labeled usually as mental illness as okay, as positive, as acceptable. And